Welcome to Work in Progress, Conversations with Creators. I'm your host, Logan Roy Spiteman. On today's episode, I was very honored to speak with Viet Thanh Nguyen, one of my literary heroes, Pulitzer Prize winner, one of the most admired writers in the world. I began with an unusually personal question about my father, who was in the Vietnam War. I think it led to an interesting discussion. I hope you enjoy.
If you enjoy our podcast, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us bring you more content like this. You can find this episode and all of our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, abqjournal.com, as well as YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. See the show notes for a discount code on a digital subscription. Thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading news.
Hello, Viet Thanh Nguyen. Thank you so much for joining me here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So this is Work in Progress, and I usually speak with artists, writers, different creative people about things they're currently working on. But I do want to start just by talking about The Sympathizer. Of course, this is the novel you won Pulitzer Prize for. It was made into a critically acclaimed HBO series. And so I did just want to start with that also because this is a book that deals with America's war in Vietnam. And, you know, my father was in that war. He said if he had it all to do over again, he would have stayed home and protested. But instead, he went there. He was injured. And so the other thing that my dad said about that war, he said, in every war, you know, the first casualty of war is the truth, right? We've heard that. And he said he felt like he was sent to Vietnam to assassinate the truth. This is a very strong statement that, you know, and it's his words. So I guess I wanted to kind of just present that because this is a war that there's many opinions and many people experience in different ways. And your novel really gives a very complex picture of the war from a very interesting perspective. But I wanted to get to kind of that idea of truth and fiction and lies in the context of war, and how do you grapple with that as a fiction writer, thinking about, I guess, truth and fiction in relation to that particular war? It's a big question. Sorry for the long question, but
I think the tricky situation here is that obviously a war involves different sides. And one of the things that I say in The Sympathizer, quoting Hegel, is that the definition of tragedy is not right versus wrong, but it's right versus right. And if we look at the war in Vietnam, all the sides involved, I think, thought they were right. They thought they were fighting on the side of truth, freedom, et cetera, et cetera. So the Sympathizer tries to acknowledge that multifaceted reality while also doing something paradoxical, which is that we can acknowledge that there is right versus right, but we still oftentimes have to make a judgment. So in the case of your father's example, this assassination of the truth, I don't think is far from a reality at all. If, for example, in the aftermath of the war, President Jimmy Carter in 1977 said that this was a war of mutual destruction. This affirms the idea that there was a symmetry to this war, that all sides suffered equally. And that was certainly how I think many Americans perceived it. But it is an assassination of the truth because, in fact, the war was not about mutual destruction. You had 3 million dead Vietnamese people, hundreds of thousands of dead Lao, Hmong, and Cambodians, and 58,000+ dead Americans. You have a situation in which the United States dropped more bombs on Indochina than in all of Europe during World War II, whereas the United States was not touched in that way. And so it was not a war that was mutual. And so that's the complexity that I think a novel like The Sympathizer, but literature in general, should be committed to, acknowledging empathetically that there are multiple ways of viewing the same reality, and yet also possibly being able to carry out this hard task of judgment.
yeah. And you've written about the war. You've written nonfiction as well as fiction, and how is that different when you're dealing with it through the lens of fiction?
In both cases, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I'm committed to narration. So if you read my nonfiction work, from Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, to my memoir, A Man of Two Faces, these are dealing with facts. These are dealing with histories, dealing with lives, but they're driven by the same narrative principles as my fiction is driven by, in terms of having characters, setting, drama, and so on. Whereas my fiction in The Sympathizer and in The Committed, for example, the sequel,
Yeah.
these are definitely novels. They have novelistic properties, but they read as if they are memoirs or confessions. So I'm interested in the blurring of the line between genres, fiction and nonfiction, because I think when faced with a situation like a horrifying war, in which everything from tragedy to comedy to horror and absurdity must be deployed, a genre doesn't really become very relevant. And in fact, trying to blur the distinctions between fiction and nonfiction seems to be very crucial, because there are ways in which the non-fictional realities of how terrifying this and other wars are exceed the capacities of fiction. And yet at the same time, we need some of the tools of fiction in order to try to create dramatic situations that are assimilable for people, because the unspeakable realities of what actually took place, unmediated by things like fiction, can be overwhelming.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, I mean, that's one characteristic of your writing. There's often a lot of humor, and humor humanizes, and, I mean, yeah, there's only so much horror that the average person, especially, if you have like a 9 to 5 job and then you want to like go home and read a nice book before you go to sleep. Do you really want to, read about the horrors of war? And yet it's important. We want to know about what happened, but to make it kind of, I guess, and especially with, the way that you write, in kind of all the tricks of metafiction and humor and everything that you get to kind of play with, I think it helps us deal with such, serious, tragic situations better.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my inspirations was Joseph Heller's Catch-22. I read that a couple of times. And how do you encompass something so vast and so insane as World War II, both for soldiers and civilians? And Heller's response was to write a novel that was very specifically focused just on American bomber crews and what they went through, and to recognize ultimately the horror of war, but to make us laugh at the same time. It's such
Yeah.
an amazing magician's trick to pull off, which is something that fiction is capable of, perhaps more so than nonfiction in many ways, where because a novelist can invent scenarios that make us laugh, and to make us realize that laughter and satire are, crucial human ways of coping with tragedy that can be overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to talk about what you were just writing?
So, we are living in very interesting times, as I think all of us realize over the last few months or years. And I've received a lot of requests from international and national publications, from The Nation to Time Magazine to the New York Times to La Stampa in Italy, and now Le Monde in France, to write about our current political situation. And so I was writing this piece for Le Monde, which is one of France's biggest newspapers, because they
Right.
wanted to ask me specifically what's happening with American writers and literature in the age of Donald Trump. And I'd written an essay about, American literature and Donald Trump for the New York Times book review back in 2020. What does American literature look like post-Trump? And now, of course, we have Trump Part 2, so we're not really post-Trump. And that's what really this essay for Le Monde looks like. Both, the possibilities of American literature, but also, trying to answer the questions of why American literature has been relatively silent and ineffectual in combating Donald Trump and what he represents.
Yeah. Well, why do you think it has been?
I think it's because I take American literature as an imperial literature. We are a global hegemonic power, and American literature is not exempt from those complications. So on the one hand, American literature does all kinds of wonderful things, as we've been talking about. On the other hand, it also serves its function of normalizing the realities of global American domination, which is fine during the age of bipartisanship and President Obama, where we had a president who had a book club and who gave book recommendations, and so
Sure.
American writers could be incorporated into that. And this idea that you could respect multiculturalism and recognize America's diversity, and yet still accommodate literature to the realities of American empire, was something that normalized empire for American writers. Under President Trump, we have a situation in which all of that liberal benevolence that presidents from Clinton to Obama to Biden represented, all that has been stripped away. So we only have naked American power at this moment. And I don't know if American writers are capable of confronting that, because it's not simply naked American power directed against the Americans, which is problematic enough. But now we see the full revelation of the imperialism that always underlaid the sort of the liberal exercise of American global power that the Democrats represented.
Yeah, I mean, but we do have writers speaking out. I mean, people like you, fortunately, you've been a very strong, passionate voice, but we also have the problem of literature being banned, right? We have unprecedented number of book bans in this country.
I take a little bit of heart in that, because what it means is, on the one hand, the conservative part of the United States does not value literature in some way.
I think you may have cut out a little bit. Could you repeat that? Sorry, you just froze for a second.
I think that, I take some heart in the book bans, because the conservative part of the United States obviously tends to devalue literature, sees it as less than useful. And yet we wouldn't have book bans and censorship if people didn't fear the power of literature. And so this, I take it as a good sign that everything from children's literature to nonfiction to novels and memoirs have been banned, because it continues to show that stories matter, and stories have the power to illuminate the complexities of the human character, but also the potential of people to resist dominant forms of power.
Yeah, I do feel like at other times, maybe sometimes there's a sense, as a writer, you think, does any of this even matter? How many, and I think that seeing the stakes of it, it does, like, in a weird way, the attempts to silence writers shows the power of writing, which I guess is what you just said. But
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, you've also been censored. You had at least one event at the Y canceled because of your opposition to the genocide in Gaza. And how have you dealt with that on a personal level?
That was one of the more unpleasant moments of my life, and certainly not something I would have invited upon myself, but certainly something that I was willing to take on. And I felt that in the long run, it was actually very beneficial for me to be, I don't know what the right term would be, canceled in that circumstance, because it was, a very personal experience about how there are off limits topics in the United States, like Gaza, and even mentioning the word genocide, that were already present under a Democratic administration and are even more evident under the Trump administration. We are really in a moment in which certain topics are considered to be thought crimes. We have the case of a student who simply wrote an op-ed expressing her opinion on the question of genocide, and has now been arrested and put into a Louisiana detention facility. So this kind of reality, whatever one's stance is on something like Israel, Palestine, Gaza, or the question of whether this is a genocide at all, the fact that certain ideas, certain arguments, certain words are being rendered off limits completely is something that should concern all of us as writers, but also just simply as citizens and residents of this country.
And how do you feel? Because you're also a professor, you're a teacher. You teach writing. I think you also you teach a course about Vietnam. And I mean, how are your students feeling in this moment?
I think that it's hard to say, because of course there's a diversity of opinion on my campus as everywhere else. But I think younger students, younger generations do tend to skew more sympathetically towards the cause of Palestinians, and are more willing to say words like settler colonialism and genocide. But even beyond that, I think that, again, the suppression of the very possibility of saying these things, as we have seen in the very violent suppression of student protesters during the encampments and afterwards up into the present moment, is teaching these students a lesson that they're quite well aware of, that there is a naked form of power out there that is quite frightened of students saying these kinds of concepts, because these concepts are disruptive not simply of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, but these concepts are disruptive of the American willingness to support that occupation and that genocide, meaning that the United States is completely tied to Israel. And so the naked exercise of power, both in terms of bombing, but also in terms of suppressing free speech in the United States, is revealing to a considerable part of the student population the complexity of the power and injustice that not only Palestinians are confronting, but their advocates and sympathizers are confronting in the United States.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So returning just a moment to the piece that you're working on for Le Monde, I'm wondering, how do you approach that as a writer? Do you have like, if you're writing something for Le Monde versus the New York Times versus, do you consider a different audience, and does that affect the way that you would write an essay?
There is a certain kind of a question of an audience. If I'm talking to Italians or French people, there's a slightly more explanation I have to provide. But I also think about the fact that maybe even for Americans, I have to provide some explanation as well, because in the Le Monde example, I'm referring back to American history and saying, hey, what Donald Trump is doing now is the naked exercise of power. But we've done that as Americans before, like in the 19th century, which I think is really where Donald Trump wants to take us. There was no restraint on Americans wiping out indigenous resistance, or Americans taking Mexico, or Americans taking the Philippines. But how many Americans actually know these facts about American history? It's not simply the French who may not be aware of some of these details, but because of the exercise of American mythology, both globally, but within the United States as well, a lot of Americans are not quite cognizant of how the United States came to be in its present shape.
Sure, and there's lots of attempts now to change curricula so that those histories are not taught.
Right, which is why American universities and schools in general are definitely a part of a culture war. And the culture war, which has been going on for a long time before Donald Trump, the culture war is ironically almost just as important as actual wars.
Yeah. Um, and I guess how much of how do I want to say this? Um, it's important for you to be a kind of public intellectual. Do you like that term? Is that a
Not really, no. I mean, I think I like the term writer, and for me, I prefer the term committed writer. I mean, like or
mm,
engaged writer. These are traditions that exist in other countries, but in the United States, we really don't have that. We don't like to mix art and politics generally in the United States. I think that goes back to the fact that we're a very anti-communist country, and mixing art and politics has this kind of communist connotation in the United States. And so writers in the US were expected to talk about the truth, of course, but the truth in terms of revelations about American power, as your father pointed out, are not very, very welcome. And so, the idea of a public intellectual seems to connote a whole separate occupation. Whereas I think that writers who are committed and engaged, as I think most writers should be, should already be thinking about what they do in a public fashion. Because if we're to speak the truth about our country, it should inevitably have a public consequence, because we're all involved in that as Americans.
do you think that like the uh, most MFA programs in the U.S. Are kind of favor a certain kind of writing that's a little bit that's not politically engaged necessarily, or also maybe not as experimental? Like there's a kind of like I don't know, sort of like bourgeois realism or something maybe that some people say dominates MFA programs. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Show don't tell, right? That's supposed to be the dominant aesthetic in
Mm,
American fiction, and undoubtedly, I think that's true. And this goes back to my idea that contemporary American literature is an imperial kind of literature, because, of course, we have writers speaking the truth about domestic realities and talking about certain kinds of injustices, from racism to sexism to homophobia and the like, and all these are important, obviously. But the capacity of writing workshops and contemporary American literature to respond to the realities of the United States as a global American hegemon, in which issues like culture wars and multiculturalism and DEI are a factor, I think that is not really a structural part of how literature is being taught in American universities, whether as a form of reading or as a form of writing. And so I really had to teach myself how to write novels that were about fiction and deployed tactics like show don't tell, but that would also deploy, other kinds of tactics like didacticism or satire, or grapple with philosophy and theory and history and politics, because American writing, workshop leaders were not teaching those kinds of things. So I think it means something when workshop leaders are willing to talk about characterization and timing and narration and point of view, but not willing to talk about how to incorporate politics, theory, philosophy, history into the act of writing. By the way, I actually have to. I'm sorry, I have to run. I have to pick up my son from school.
Thank you. Thank you so much for spending this time with us, and it's been a real honor. And thank you for everything that you do.
I'm looking so forward to my visit to Albuquerque and Santa Fe. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And this was Work in Progress, Conversations with Creators. And as you see, Viet Thanh Nguyen is a very busy person. He's politically committed, also has commitments to his family, his students, but we really appreciate him taking this time to speak with us today, and we appreciate you for listening. Now, if you enjoy this programming, please like and subscribe, and if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please let us know. Thank you. Until next time.